Go. All right, welcome everybody. So today we're going to kind of go over some of the big topics from units 1 and 2. The AP kind of divides up the different time periods as such. Period 1, 1200 to 1450. Period 2, 1450 to 1750. Period 3, 1750 to 1900. And the last period, 1900 to the present day. These percentages right here, this is kind of the exam weight. So about 10% to 8%, that's period 1, unit 1, I should say, and unit 2. But today, of course, we're going to cover unit 1 and 2. So the AP provides some distinct course themes. So these are themes of each of the different units in this class. And basically how I thought this would go is I would go over kind of examples that would answer these themes from each of the time periods. So today we're going to do the first period. This is kind of more so for my students on the AP review thing. I not only have this website, this PowerPoint, but also I have another kind of example of kind of more specific evidences for each of the topics for this class. All right, let's go ahead and get started then. So the very first course theme is this idea of humans and the environment. And units 1 and 2 is basically going to be about trade. Trade is the biggest concept in unit 1 and 2. And we're going to talk about trade more in a second, but in terms of its environmental aspects of it, one of the kind of common themes is how does trade impact, the environment impact trade? And it impacts them in these variety of ways. For one thing, the Indian Ocean Maritime System. This is primarily driven by the monsoon system. If you ever get a question kind of related to the Indian Ocean Maritime Trade System, it's probably to do with the monsoon system. But why do people trade? They want natural resources. Natural resources you can only get in specific places. China, what can you get? Silk, tea, porcelain. So when you're studying for the AP, kind of distinguish where things come from, who trades what. So China, kind of everybody wants silk. And why do people want silk? Why does China have, I almost gave it away. China has a monopoly on silk. That's why it's such a big destination. That's why it's so valuable. All right, so you should know kind of other areas that have natural resources. India, spices, cotton, ivory, for example. West Africa, salts, gold, slaves. So understanding what comes from where, that's going to be kind of something you should focus on when you're studying for unit 1 and 2. All right. Another big thing is going to be the diffusion of new products, of agricultural products that spread because of trade. These are some examples of that. Not just luxury goods, not just goods that cost money, but also agricultural products, things that we might not consider as valuable. But bananas are going to become a big aspect of cultures in Africa, citrus and sugar from Central Asia going to Europe. And then on the terms review, you have champa rice. Champa rice is very significant because this new strain of rice is going to greatly increase agricultural yields. And that relates actually to another point about the environment, is the impact on agriculture. All right. But also this encompasses the idea of disease being spread. Disease spreads because of trade. That's a continuity in this class. A time period you can compare all of this to is the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange saw the diffusion of plants, animals, and disease from the old to the new world. Very similar developments in Eurasia between 1200 and 1450. Right. In terms of agriculture, we are seeing generally there's more food production going on. Though climate is warmer during this time, the medieval warm period is what it's called, and that generally leads to better agricultural yields. More food means more people means urbanization as well. That's generally true. But also the environment impacts where civilizations are. Trading cities tend to form around choke points, meaning areas that are confined. And one example of that is the Strait of Malacca. Remember, Malacca is that region. This is going to be a very bad map of Indonesia, but it's kind of this area between Southeast Asia and the Indonesian islands. The Strait of Malacca is going to see empires like the Srivijaya Empire, for example. So empires tend to form in areas where there is good trade access. The Srivijaya Empire, an example of that. But also the environment impacts how people live. Some groups of people are nomadic. They move from place to place. Good example of that are the Bedouin in the Middle East. But another one is one from Central Asia. And that, of course, is the Mongols. Yes. Thank you. All right. So that's the environment. Any questions about the environment kind of in Unit 1 and 2? Any kind of general questions? All right. So in terms of culture, there are a few things you would need to know. Religion is probably one of the big ones. Unit 1 in particular introduces a lot of religious ideas. And there are a few religions you should be familiar with. Islam is probably one of the most important. Islam, of course, monotheistic faith, one God, that sort of thing. Kind of being familiar with the ideas of Islam. You don't need to memorize the 5 pillars of Islam, but there are some important concepts you do need to understand. For one thing, sometimes there are questions about the Hajj. Anybody remember what Hajj is by any chance? Yeah. Yeah, it's the pilgrimage, exactly. And the reason why I bring this point up in particular is that people move, they travel to go to Mecca. And a big idea in this unit, in these 2 units, is travel. So religious reasons for travel, Hajj. Another big thing about Islam, though, is this idea of being literate, of being educated. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, roughly, kind of is memorizing and studying the Quran, the central holy book of Islam. So if you're unable to read the Quran, you're not going to be a good Muslim, basically. So this focus on literacy is going to help explain intellectual developments like the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic Golden Age, as you might remember, is this time of scientific advances, technological advances. Because oftentimes when these Muslim scholars are reading the Quran, they oftentimes want to back up what they're reading with scientific understanding of the natural world. So kind of to support their faith, their belief, we do see advances in science. We also do see that Islam is a monotheistic religion, an Abrahamic religion. So we do see that this is going to lead actually to this idea of religious tolerance, especially to Abrahamic religions, Christians, Jews, but also Zoroastrians as well, even though they're not considered Abrahamic. Another kind of thing about Islam is that it tends to spread via trade. I hate saying the word trade and diffusion, but I'm going to keep saying it. Trade leads to the diffusion of religion. But specifically, how does that happen? Well, as people are moving and trading, oftentimes they are forming merchant diasporic communities. These are communities, ethnic enclaves, you could almost say, in faraway places where Muslims, for example, gather together and they practice their beliefs. So we are going to see a spread of Islam to different parts around the world. West, East, and North Africa, for example, Central Asia, but also into India as well. It starts, of course, on the Arabian Peninsula. All right. In terms of artistic developments, kind of the reason why we don't see much in the way of physical imagery in the Islamic world is this idea of monotheism. No idols, no depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, no physical depictions of people, basically. But also Islam also will see this idea of syncretism. Syncretism is the blending of 2 different cultures to make something unique. And we do see syncretism in the places Islam is spreading to, which is everywhere, basically. And there are a few reasons why syncretism will happen. And one of them is going to be Sufism. Sufis are non-traditional Muslims. They are kind of Muslims that engage in unorthodox religious practices. For example, we do have kind of this phenomenon known as the whirling dervish. So kind of this idea of a non-traditional practice of Islam is appealing to societies in places like Southeast Asia. These places kind of are looking to understand Islam through their own cultures. And oftentimes cultures in Southeast Asia, their forms of worship generally involve kind of physical movement. So kind of the Sufis are able to combine local customs with Islamic teachings. And we'll also see that in West Africa as well. In West Africa, we do see that Islam will be an important political basis. One of the ideas of Islam is going to be this notion of Sharia. And Sharia is Islamic law. It's a legal code based on the central holy book of Islam. I misspelled that. The Quran. The Quran, of course, is this religious document, but it also has legal implications as well. Societies are looking to build their governments based on a shared law. And where can you find this law? In the Quran. So the Quran is the basis of many Islamic legal systems. It's the basis of political systems. But also West African rulers in particular, they're going to adopt this idea known as the royal cult. Basically, it's the idea that the king is the moral defender of West African societies. That in order to preserve Islam, everyone has to look up to the king as a moral example. The king is going to say, I understand the Quran, I've been reading and teaching and practicing all of these things. I am a moral example. So this is a way that we see political legitimacy being formed, this idea of leading through a moral code. All right. And the Sunita, that is from Mali, actually. It's a royal myth. It's a collection of stories about the formation of the kingdom of Mali. But the reason why it's significant and the reason why I connect it to Islam is that this introduction of Arabic as a written language is also developing culture as well in West Africa. Literacy in terms of writing, I should say. All right. And of course, Islam will be important in the other periods as well. All right. And before we continue, any questions generally about Islam and these ideas right here? Anything you would want me to explain one more time? Yeah.
So if there's strict monotheism without iconoclasm, what would be the best way to explain syncretism? What's an example that you would use if you were to give it?
I would say anything to do with I'd say this idea of the whirling dervish, this non-traditional physical form of worship through dancing. That's a way to diffuse and promote cultural development, not through images. But also architecture, that is a good point right there. Architecture is another example of syncretism. The University of Timbuktu is a good example of cultural syncretism. It combines West African architecture for the purpose of an Islamic university. All right, any other questions? Awesome, awesome. Neo-Confucian possum. All right, so Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism is basically a strict interpretation of Confucius's original writings. Confucius, famous Chinese intellectual, famous Chinese philosopher, is going to be the basis of this cultural idea. Neo-Confucianism is not exactly a religion. It's more of a cultural and philosophical belief, I would say. And it is going to be the basis of many East Asian societies, especially China. One of the topics on Unit 1 actually is the diffusion of Chinese cultural practices across East Asia. So we are going to see that Neo-Confucian ideas will spread to Japan and to other parts of East Asia, Vietnam being another example. And we call this process of Chinese diffusion sinification. Sinification is the idea of adopting Chinese cultural practices. But in terms of cultural practices, well, here are some big ideas of Neo-Confucianism. Filial piety is one of them. Filial piety essentially is worship and respect, reverence for ancestors, for older family members, for parents, for mothers, or for fathers, I should say, for parental figures. But it also is related to gender as well. There is this idea of more male dominance in society, in a Neo-Confucian society. So because of Neo-Confucianism, we see social orders forming in East Asian societies. There's this idea of respect to one's betters, to one's authority figures. So you can kind of already see why this is a political concept. Respect for one's superiors. It's a way to ensure culturally people are listening to the emperor, for example. So kind of Neo-Confucianism helps justify gender hierarchies, family hierarchies, but also various social and class hierarchies. In Neo-Confucian societies, merchants tend to be at the bottom. Merchants are not trusted. Merchants are tricksters, kind of. So there is this idea of kind of lower aspect for merchants, especially. I'd also say education is a big value of Neo-Confucianism, especially learning and memorizing Confucius's texts. But also Neo-Confucianism lends itself to kind of cultural isolationism. This idea of Chinese ethnic superiority sometimes is associated with Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism helps explain Chinese isolationism, and there are periods of Chinese isolationism in the Ming Dynasty, for example. But also this kind of idea that China is the civilized center of the world. It is the Middle Kingdom. All right. Kind of similar to how Neo-Confucianism is used to justify hierarchies, Hinduism. Hinduism, of course, sees the caste system. And the caste system kind of does separate people into different social classes based on religious ideas. So kind of on the top, we have the priestly caste, the Brahmins, and then all the way at the bottom, those quote unquote untouchables. And kind of if you have a religious hierarchy, that has a lot of political implications as well. You want to be on top. You want to kind of listen to the people on top of you because they're clearly religiously more important than you. However, despite the fact that Hinduism is more of a caste system-based society, it's also considered an ethnic religion. It doesn't spread as much as Islam or Buddhism, so it's not a missionary religion, a universalizing religion. But we do see unorthodox practices in Hinduism. For example, the Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement was kind of for lower caste people, for women as well. And it's more of a personalized religion. I have a personal connection to this spiritual figure, to a specific god in Hinduism. So it's a challenge to the caste system, I guess, is the significance of the Bhakti movement. But speaking of challenges to Hinduism, we've got Buddhism. Buddhism is going to emerge largely as a rejection of these strict social hierarchies. Buddhism is more popular, especially among lower caste, lower class people in East Asia. And Buddhism is also a good example of a missionizing religion. It will heavily diffuse thanks to trade. Buddhism will spread to places like China, Japan. It is from India originally, but it will also go to Southeast Asia. Buddhism kind of will stress these ideas of meditation. It's a rejection of the caste system, but it also has this idea of monasticism, of having monasteries where specialized monks train and they become missionaries. So generally kind of monasticism will help explain the missionary aspect of Buddhism. But Buddhism also kind of lends itself to syncretism as well. There are a lot of different branches of Buddhism, but the one most susceptible to syncretism is Mahayanan Buddhism. Mahayanan Buddhism kind of blends together local customs with Buddhist teachings. And there are different forms of Mahayanan, one of them being Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism will be popular. This marker is dying. Will be popular. This is really dying. In China, because it is going to kind of allow for Chinese ancestral worship to be combined with Buddhist meditation practices, for example. So Zen Buddhism is a type of Mahayanan Buddhism. This is even worse. And it is going to be yet another example of syncretism. Do none of my markers work? TUSD. You're embarrassed. All right. Any questions kind of about these religions right here? All righty then. One more, Christianity. Christianity, of course, is going to be the major religion of European societies in the East and in the West. So in the West of Europe, mostly we see kind of two branches of Christianity, or I should say we see generally two branches before the Protestant Reformation. And in the West, we have Catholicism. Catholicism controlled, of course, by a central holy figure, the Pope. The Pope, based in Rome, is going to have a lot of cultural and political influence over Western Europe. But much like Confucianism, much like Hinduism, Christianity is used as a social hierarchy supporting sort of system. And one example of that is going to be, I have two examples actually. One of them is gender. So the idea that women should be lower than men can be justified using a misinterpretation of Christianity. You know why women are considered lower than men? You know the biblical story? It all goes back to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, the first two humans, Eve, commits a terrible sin by eating a forbidden fruit. Suddenly all humanity is damned for the rest of time. So kind of we do see that religion will be used to justify social and gender hierarchies. In terms of social hierarchies, there's something known as the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being essentially is that all society is ordered. God is on top, kings below them. So the idea of divine rights. And then below the kings, everybody else. So this idea that there's a natural social hierarchy is justified through religion. Yes?
These amended heaven, very important.
That's a Chinese
I know,
concept.
but you can use it like.
Oh, you can connect it to another time
Yeah,
period.
continuities.
A continuity is people use religious concepts to justify social and political hierarchies, like the mandate of heaven. Well,
Yeah.
follow instructions. Okay. We tend to see in Western Europe that the Pope tends to be kind of more politically important than kings. Literally, the Pope has the power to crown kings. A good example of this is Charlemagne from way back when. But the reason why I'm mentioning this kind of specific thing, that popes tend to have more political power than the king, is that it's one of the explanations for political decentralization in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it's the exact opposite. While Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, does influence culture, politically, Orthodox are under the control of the state, under control of the secular government. There's the idea of Caesaropapism, the idea that the Caesar or emperor picks out the leader of the Orthodox Church, the patriarch. So this is kind of a difference right here. Eastern Europe more centralized, Western Europe more decentralized. There is less central political authority in Western Europe. All right, other topics about religion. Some places have religious tolerance, namely multi-religious societies, huge land-based empires with lots of different religions. And if you are a multi-religion empire, why would you want religious tolerance? What's the political reason why you might want religious tolerance? Yeah.
So that you can justify it, because if you don't allow for religious diversity, then there will inevitably be revolt.
Yeah, so if you are very strict, that means you have a whole bunch of enemies that could pop up. The Mongols, for example, didn't force people to convert to Tengrism, their native religion. So the Mongols, good example of tolerance. The Abbasid Caliphate, also a good example. The only kind of thing I would add about the Abbasids is that religious tolerance wasn't completely free. You had the jizya tax. Anybody remember the jizya tax in very basic terms? Yeah. You.
If you didn't believe this, you get taxed if you believe what you want to believe.
Yeah, if you weren't a Muslim, you would be taxed, but you could worship whatever you want. You could be a Christian, you could be a Jew, you just had to pay taxes. So you could say that's a kind of a counter argument, an although clause in a way. Yeah.
You still have to be under the group of people's book.
Yeah, that tends to be the case though. So mostly it's going to be applied to Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians actually. Did you have a? Okay. All right, syncretism happens all the time. cross-cultural connections leads to religious syncretism, general continuity. Few examples of that, Ethiopia. Ethiopia develops kind of this mix of Judaism, Christianity, but also native Ethiopian religion as well. The Kievan Rus, kind of their culture as an example of syncretism, combines Byzantine and Slavic and Scandinavian influences all mixed together, but also Islam in West Africa. And we mostly see that through architecture like the University of Timbuktu that I mentioned earlier. Trade diffuses ideas. Trade is going to diffuse religion, but it's also going to diffuse Greco-Roman ideas. The Greeks and the Romans, their ideas were being cultivated during the big event in the Islamic world. Islamic Golden Age, yes. So the Islamic Golden Age, those ideas will diffuse to Europe, thanks to connections based on trade. So kind of these cross-cultural interactions lead to things like the Renaissance, for example, in Western Europe. All right, but also kind of example of cultural ideas spreading are travelers. There are different international travelers in this time period. Marco Polo from Venice and Ibn Battuta from Morocco. These two guys sometimes appear as primary sources on the AP. So generally kind of understanding that they're examples of cross-cultural interaction. Language spreads too. Swahili is a good example of syncretism. Bantu, Arabic, mixed together make Swahili. Arabic is used as a universal trading language. All Muslims are expected, well, not in the past, expected to learn Arabic. So that's kind of a big part of that. Uyghur script, also a big part of that. It's the Mongol written language, basically. It's a combination of Chinese characters, so the Chinese alphabet, and Mongolian language. It's a mix of those things. Also, trade leads to people moving into diasporic communities. But we also see kind of this idea of the Bantu migrations. The Bantu migrations are going to lead these Bantu ethnic people to move into sub-Saharan Africa. And when people move, they bring with them their language, their culture, and ideas of technology. With the Bantu migration, oftentimes there might be kind of, the answer would be ironwork, for example, ironworking. They brought ironworking from West Africa into sub-Saharan Africa. All right. So that's kind of it for culture. Any questions? Anything you want me to talk about just a little bit more? Yes?
That's how they think. So what was the significance of that civilization as a whole?
As a whole, kind of, I would connect it to this idea of trade being the basis of various states during this time, because the Kievan Rus was a key trade center between Northern Europe and Central Asia. Yeah. Yes.
Was the Great Schism before this time period?
The Great Schism is before, but it helps explain why there's that religious difference between Orthodox and Catholicism. Any other questions? Awesome. Governance. The general trend of Unit 1 is decentralization. Decentralization is the idea of a less organized political society. Because before this time period, we had big land-based empires like the Romans, like the Han Dynasty in China. So really kind of we're in the period when we're experiencing decentralization, less organized empires. However, the trend by the end of Unit 1 and 2 is more political centralization. We tend to see governments start to get their act together. So we do see a slow transition away from decentralization towards centralization generally. But centralization won't be a more universal idea until next time period, until period 2 in AP Worlds, not second period. Okay. We also kind of see some other trends as well. Some groups of nomads are going to settle down. The Mongols are a really good example of this. The Mongols, they're doing their thing, making empires, but some of them will kind of integrate, assimilate into sedentary societies. All right, kind of something that I brought up just a little bit ago. is this idea that societies will form to control trade routes. These are all examples of trade-based societies in period 1. Venice, the Hanseatic League. This is kind of a merchant confederacy in the north of Europe. So individual city-states agree to remove restrictions on trade. Sound familiar? It's kind of sometimes called a early European Union. So if you want to make that connection. Srivijaya Empire controls the Strait of Malacca. Kievan Rus controls trade between Northern Europe and Central Asia. The Swahili coast on the east of Africa. Chocoya is a city, and I'm mispronouncing it, but Chocoya was a city on the Mississippi River. It's a Native American city that's largely trade-based. Aztec Inca trade, Mongols trade. Another kind of theme is that when these societies form, they tend to use older civilizations as a template, as a model to build their own civilization. The Aztecs, they really built on the legacy of the Mayans. The Ottomans, they built their legacy on the basis of the Mongols. The Byzantines obviously built their society on the basis of the Romans, but the Russians did as well. Also, in order to legitimize your rule, rulers sometimes sponsor art. Some examples of that, the Ilkhanate in the Middle East. This was the Mongol Middle Eastern dynasty, basically. They sponsored the Second Islamic Golden Age. So that's what that acronym stands for. So kind of, we do see kind of that culture will be promoted by governments. The Abbasids also build up culture. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad is an example of that. The Yuan dynasty will also kind of contribute to culture as well. They allow foreign travelers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta to journey into their country, and kind of that leads to kind of cross-cultural interaction. But it also helps legitimize the Yuan as a trading society. They're showing to the rest of the world, we've got goods, you should come and visit us, basically. All right, and we're going to look at China in just a second. Any questions about these general ideas? Yes. The Ilkhanate. I don't know how to pronounce half of the things I talk. All right. China, what to say about China? China is probably one of the biggest areas you would need to focus on the AP exam, and I'm just going to say that outright. China and India tend to have the most questions about them. You don't need to memorize every single dynasty in Chinese history, but there are there are kind of 5 big ones for you guys. There's the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty has its own kind of topic lesson objective, so they're fairly important. There's also the Yuan and the Ming. A lot of examples of continuity with all the Chinese dynasties, the most important being Neo-Confucianism and the idea of the civil service. So a written exam in order for people to be government workers, basically. We also have this concept of the bureaucracy. And a bureaucracy is essentially all the institutions that help make government possible. And that includes things like the mail system, that includes taxation, that includes census taking. So kind of the bureaucracy is one way we see organization, centralization in China. And those institutions will exist in basically every dynasty except the Yuan dynasty. Meritocracy means basically making a government based on the best and most educated people, the people who pass the civil service exam. But also the Song dynasty is important because it will help with commercialization. Commercialization is the idea of using the state, using government to help promote the economy, and the economy becomes more trade-based. The Yuan dynasty is kind of the exception to all of these sorts of trends in Chinese history. They do not have the civil service. Their meritocracy is less based on the civil service exam and more based on the emperor picking out guys who are loyal to him, but also he considers skilled in their fields. So sometimes the Yuan dynasty will employ workers from across Eurasia. They'll pick out Muslim scholars and move them to China, for example. But the Yuan dynasty is significant because compared to other dynasties, the Yuan is a time in which China is more closely connected to other societies around the world. And we see that in the form of merchants from other countries living within China. This is the time when the Chinese allowed Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta to come in and experience their society. The Ming Dynasty, basically a return to normalcy in China. Civil service exam, Neo-Confucianism, all those wonderful things are back. But the Ming are unique because they really don't like foreigners. The Mongols were super unpopular in China. And in reaction to that, we do start to see a trend of more isolationism, of what we call ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the idea of kind of being focused on an ethnic group. That ethnic superiority is kind of what to associate ethnic centrism with. If you want to connect it to another time period, but be very careful in how I'm going to explain this, you could connect it to nationalism. However, don't straight up say that this is a form of nationalism. Nationalism is not an AP world history development until after 1750. And we'll talk about that more later. All right, India, decentralization. It's divided. There are a few reasons why. Geography limits travel. India is huge. There are mountains and deserts and jungles and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Are there bears? Yeah, there are bears. Okay. And lions. So we do see kind of there is this division geographically. It's hard to unite or centralize in India because of geographical differences, but also cultural differences as well. There are hundreds of different ethnic and language groups in India. However, there are some attempts to unify India. For example, Muslim invaders like the Delhi Sultanate and eventually the Mughal Empire. Western Europe is very decentralized. The main reason for that is its reliance on the systems of feudalism and serfdom. Feudalism, a king gives land to nobles in exchange for military service. On this land, serfs work for the noble. Feudalism is political organization in Europe during the Middle Ages. Serfdom is the labor organization in Europe, not slavery. Any question? Anybody want me to redefine kind of the difference between feudalism and serfdom? So feudalism is kind of this political organization. So the king gives land to nobles. The nobles in exchange are military support for the king. Whereas serfdom describes peasants living on that land, giving their labor to the noble in exchange for protection. Serfdom more impacts the peasants, feudalism, the whole structure, the king, the noble, all that things. All right, any other questions, any questions? All right. Another explanation for decentralization is the political power of the church, of the Catholic Church. A good example of that is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, not a centralized monarchy. In fact, the Pope kind of has an influence over the Holy Roman emperors. Eastern Europe, we do see an example of centralization in the Byzantine Empire, but guess what? It goes away. It goes away because of Muslim invaders. So as the Byzantine Empire collapses, unity will happen in the Middle East thanks to Muslim groups. At first, it's the Seljuk Turks. I'll write their name down. The Seljuk Turks. But as we'll talk about more next period, they're going to kind of be replaced by the Ottomans in the 1400s. All right, any questions? All right, Americas, Aztec, Inca. These are highly centralized states. How are they highly centralized? Shared religion. So a religious idea that promotes worship of the emperor, worship of kind of central political leaders. Political leaders oftentimes had religious roles in Aztec society. A lot of these practices kind of demonstrated state authority over people. Human sacrifice being probably the most brutal, the most memorable. But we also do see that in order to build up these societies, the Aztec heavily promoted merchant activity. They protected people, they protected these trade routes, and they also did build infrastructure. They built up the Lake Texcoco to be a merchant activity center. In terms of infrastructure, building canals, for example, that's what I meant to say. But they also built up agriculture as well with chiampas. All right, so building up infrastructure like canals, like chiampas, those are two ways economically they will centralize pre-Columbian times. State religion also kind of served as a warning to enemies of the Aztec Empire, for example. Conquered people would be forced to pay tribute, and we often did see ritualistic sacrifice as well. But also the Aztecs built up culture through things like pyramids. And the most kind of famous example of these pyramids during this time is going to be the one at Chichen, this place right here. So kind of we do see the building of cultural monuments during this time that largely do embody Mayan architecture. All right. However, kind of a counter argument could be that there are nomadic societies in North America, the Sioux being one example of that, hunting buffalo. In Africa, kingdoms tend to form around trade. The most important is Mali. Mali, that's where Mansa Musa is from. He's the guy that does all the trade in the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. Ghana, kind of a precursor to Mali. Great Zimbabwe on the Swahili coast, also involved in trade. But of course, the Mongols. You cannot escape the Mongols in this class. The Mongols built up their legitimacy through religious tolerance. They also kind of kept all of existing government structures in place and kind of realized these systems worked before we got here. The only thing we're going to add is the tribute system. We're going to collect tribute from people we conquer, so we get something out of it, but the day-to-day administration is left to locals. So the Khans delegate power. But as the Mongol Empire collapses, we see new states emerge, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, for example. All right. So what questions might you have about any of these societies? Very quick overview, obviously. Yeah.
What's the states?
The Gunpowder Empires, the Mughals, the Ottomans, and the Safavids. Any other questions? All right, we're almost done. Economic systems, trade. There are three big trade routes you would absolutely need to know. Silk Road, Trans-Saharan, and the Indian Ocean Maritime System. But there are also other trade routes as well, in the Americas with the Aztec Empire, for example, but also in the Mediterranean Sea. However, the most important are the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan and the Indian Ocean System. What causes trade to happen? Technology. Technologies like the astrolabe, the camel, or camel's not a technology, but the use of the camel is also going to allow for overland transportation. The dhow, a ship, the junk, a ship, the compass, you know what a compass is. Kind of you would need to know where things are from, so kind of pay attention a little bit. The astrolabe, the dhow, these things are mostly from Islamic societies. They are examples of technological innovations in and as a result of the Islamic Golden Age. The other technology I would add is the lateen sail. The lateen sail, in combination with the dhow, in combination with the astrolabe, will allow for easier navigation. But from China, we have the junk, which is a type of ship, and the compass. The compass will allow for overseas and overland trade. Why do people trade? They need resources. They need resources from places they can't get to easily. We also do see that states tend to support trade by building infrastructure. A good example in China is the Grand Canal, for example. Building onto the Grand Canal, that's how the Song dynasty is helping commercialization. Economic practices also help trade, including, but not limited to, the caravanserai, paper money, and banking establishments. So all of these things allow for easier credit, easier trade across different regions. But also kind of trade happens because of political unification. The Mongols are a good example of that. The Mongols unified the Silk Road and protected it. That's what made them so important in terms of world history. So all of those developments on the Silk Road happened mostly because of the Mongols. But also conflict does lead to cross-cultural interactions, the Crusades being an example of that. Muslims being attacked by Christians. Christians set up kingdoms in the Middle East. They make trade connections with Muslim groups. This is when we start to see Greco-Roman ideas coming to Western Europe, when we see sugar and citrus coming to Europe, for example, the apple, to use one example. All right, and the effects of trade are pretty self-explanatory, but diffusion of religion, diffusion of culture and technology, the rise of new states to control this trade, but also it will lead to further cultural exchange, namely with religion. That's the biggest one. All right. Any questions kind of about trade in general? Really the three biggest trade systems you would need to know: Silk Road, Trans-Saharan, and the Indian Ocean maritime system. Any questions? You look very puzzled. I was just making fun of you. I was making fun of a student. It's not funny anyway. Okay, whatever. All right. So in terms of social interaction and organization, generally the class system around the world is the aristocracy, the nobility having political dominance over society. And we mostly see this in Western Europe, for example, with feudalism, but also in Japan as well. So that's kind of a connection between these two societies. Other systems of class, the caste system, we already talked about that. We mostly see slavery in the Middle East and Africa. Slavery, not really an international concept just yet. That will change next period. Slaves, though, in kind of the Middle East, do kind of have some rights that are guaranteed to them in Sharia, so in Islamic law. So there is that aspect kind of going on. Kind of a specific class of people in China are the scholar gentry. These are well-educated Chinese government officials. They pass the civil service exam. They dominate Chinese social hierarchy. And remember, kind of another thing about China that makes it unique is that merchants tend to be on the bottom of that society. Merchants tend to be on the bottom of places like Europe, or excuse me, China and Japan, but also Europe. Religiously, merchant activity is kind of discouraged in Western Europe, mostly because of this concept known as usury. Usury is the idea of charging interest for loans, and according to an interpretation of the Bible, that is strictly verboten, that is strictly forbidden in Christian world. So the idea of usury kind of limits merchant activity in Western Europe. That's why getting rid of the Catholic Church in the Protestant Reformation was a big deal for merchants, because Protestantism stresses individual interpretation of the Bible. I could interpret it to say, I can charge whatever I want. I can be a good merchant. And we'll talk about that more later. Merchants tend to have a higher place in the Islamic world at this time. And that's a gross oversimplification, but it's a general theme. We also see that religious leaders sometimes served as political ones as well. The Caliph, for example, the successor of Muhammad, he was a political force in the Abbasid Caliphate, for example. And the Pope, of course, we already talked about him and his influence. Women are important, but Darren.
What was usury again?
Usury is the idea of charging interest for a loan. All right. Women, status of women tends to be lower than men. That's general continuity in world history. You think it's funny for women to be on the lower end? You think it's funny for women to be on the lower?
That's
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a joke, but okay.
I know, but.
All right. In the Islamic world, some rights for women include property ownership. China, Europe, Asia, no, not really for rich women. We do see kind of restricted social practices for women, for rich women in China. Foot binding is an example of that. In Europe, we also kind of see this second-class citizenship for women, but also in India as well. The caste system is not just a social hierarchy, but also has gendered implications as well. So women tend to be on the bottom of Indian society. That's really true for rich women. For poor women, women and children were working in the fields alongside men. That's a general true thing throughout the world. A lot of these restrictions on women mostly apply to rich women. For poor women, they're working alongside with men and women. It's a male-dominated society, don't get me wrong, but we do see that there is more economic opportunity for women. In the Americas and Africa, there tends to be kind of more of a cultural importance for women. Women sometimes have religious authorities, religious positions in these societies, and there tends to be kind of more political power as well given to women. The Mongols, pretty great if you were a woman in the Mongol ranks. There was this sense of gender equality in the form of divorce being allowed, in the form of property ownership. However, of course, kind of the exception to that is the treatment of women as the Mongols conquered the rest of the world. I mean, there's a reason why 1 out of every 200 human beings is related to Genghis Khan, and it's not for good reasons. All right. So these are kind of class structures. These are kind of ideas of gender in this world. All right, any questions? All right, let's finish this up pretty soon. We already kind of talked about religious tolerance. It's true in these places, in the Mongol world, in the Abbasid Caliphate, and really before the Russians, before the Romanov dynasty, we do see kind of acceptance for Jewish people as well in the so-called Pale of Settlement. This is a region of Eastern Europe in which we saw kind of some Eastern European kings. They allowed Jewish settlement in those regions. But of course, kind of a big continuity, unfortunately, is that we will see attacks on kind of religious groups throughout history. In the Middle Ages, against Jews and the Romani, and we'll see that continue, of course, in other time periods as well. All right, in terms of labor, where are people working? Farms, farming, farms, peasants. That tends to be kind of the trend. The other thing is that serfdom tends to be specific to Europe. And serfdom is going to decline because of the Black Death. That's just a general true statement. The main reason for that is that as serfs die off, serfs die off, their labor becomes so much more valuable. They have more bargaining power. They can move wherever the heck they want to because their value as a worker is so much higher since there are so less workers because all of them are dead. Slavery tends to be kind of in these places, the Islamic world and the Aztec. Urban centers, this is where we start to see more merchant activity, and the merchants become more politically relevant in these places. All right, any questions? And the last one right here, technology. This is the most self-explanatory. These are all technological developments during this time. Trade, astrolabe, compass, dhow, junk. Economic practices, military technology, the most important being gunpowder. Math, Arabic numerals. Anybody know where Arabic numerals come from? India, yes, you avoided the trick, yes. So the concept of the zero, for example, mathematical diffusion from South Asia to the European states. Greco-Roman ideas also kind of in the Islamic world, and they are spreading to the Europeans. The printing press, where's that from? No, not Germany. China, yes, East Asia. Textile production, silk, paper, China. Metallurgy, China. Ironworking, China. Agriculture. These are some innovations in that regard. Champa rice and chiampas. These are the floating islands that the Aztec use. All right, and terrace farming, that's for the Inca. All right, any questions? All right, anything you would want me to go over just a little bit more? All right, so what we're going to do now, and it is hard to see, so if you have your laptops with you, this presentation is already up there. I want you to kind of work with somebody right next to you. I want you to do these SAQ questions right here. What's the very first thing you do when you see a big scary block of text? You don't read the text, you read the bottom and you read the questions, exactly. So what I want you to do right now, completely optional, but work with your neighbor, kind of work through these questions right here. Identify and explain one way the source is an example of an enduring state structure. Identify and explain one reason why the Song dynasty is considered a golden age. And then one example of an economic change during this time. Talk to your neighbor, read through the prompt right there. And you can write this down, that's completely fine. Over.